Well, good morning out there in Zoom land. I'm Melody Lopez and I'm your MC today. So our panelists coming up for session one can feel free to turn on the video. In the meantime, I just gently want to talk about the structure of today. As mentioned earlier by the wonderful Althea, we carefully constructed with a lot of advice about what were some preliminary steps needed so that people can really have authentic relationships and then collaborations with tribal nations. So obviously, the first place we started was sovereignty. And I loved that video. Sharon, I think I am going to use that video. Add a ton of things to opening. Before I talk, I think I'm just going to show that video to understand some great core concepts in sovereignty. But that word, it means so many different things to different people. So this panel, we're kind of going to explore some different concepts of sovereignty. So we're going to begin with Anne-Marie Chischili, and she's going to discuss more about political sovereignty. We're going to have Ms. Stephanie Carroll talk about Indigenous data sovereignty. And for a real special treat for everyone out there, we have District Chairman Austin Nunez from the San Javier District of the Tohono Nation. And he's going to actually discuss natural sovereignty as illustrated through personhood. So these are three different views of sovereignty, but they all intersect. They all kind of culminate in different ways to approach working with tribes. So I'm going to begin with everyone just briefly introducing yourself, and then we're going to go back and have our discussions. So please unmute and introduce yourself, Anne-Marie.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome. I'm Anne-Marie Chischili, and I'm coming to you from Flagstaff, Arizona. And in this territory, it's sacred to 11 tribes, including my own, the Navajo Nation. I'm Dene, and I'm enrolled at the Navajo Nation. And according to my customs, I introduce myself by my clans. So Sheyan Not Adene Tkachini Shlent Orachini Bashichin. Hanegaki Ada Shiche, my Deshgizni Ada Chanela, Leishkansko, Ado Chimbitko, Ayisnasha, Akuta, Dines Sanchla, Yate Anosco. It's a pleasure to be here, and I look forward to the discussion today. And thank you, Melanie, and all the organizers for the invitation.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. Now the audience knows who's related to you and how. That's very important to have. Stephanie, can you please introduce yourself?
Thank you, Melody. Sidak Atnakastan, Sidak Stephanie Carroll, Tishu Stas, Landak Melchina. I'm Stephanie Carroll. I'm Atna, a citizen of the native village of Kludika. I'm also of Sicilian descent. I am from the Paintberry clan, and my father is from the Down from the Sky clan. And I'm here on the unceded lands of the Tohono and Yaqui peoples in Tucson or Tucson, Arizona, where I work at the University of Arizona, and it's College of Public Health as well as its Native Nations Institute. And as you'll hear later, the vast majority of my work focuses on Indigenous rights and interests in data. I'm happy to be here today and to learn from everybody here. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie. Please, District Chairman Nunez, can you introduce yourself?
Yes, Melody. Good morning. Skik Kusa Jamoy. Banchiki Austin Nunez Jetki Kamihap Wakta. Jewett, Mamum Tonatum Humichkum. Sisapantat Manihachkim Mamum. Good morning to all of you. My name is Austin Nunez, and I am here from our traditional ancestral homelands of our Wakotum, Tonatum Nation. And I'm very honored to be joining all of you, distinguished panelists and all of the presenters of this forum. And thank you, Melody, for allowing me to be a part of this conversation. Thank you.
Well, good morning, everyone. You know, I just caught the last end of that video, and it felt like I was back in law school, you know, just understanding the nitty gritty of federal sovereignty. And I was just like, Whew, that was a long time ago, but you know, it never grows old because tribes are eternally sovereign. So understanding tribal sovereignty is a part of my discussion today. I'm going to talk about the political issues that are currently happening in the climate arena, just to get you underway. As a background, I'm an attorney, I'm an environmental law attorney, and I work for the, I'm the director at the Institute for Tribal Environmental Professionals, ITEP, located here at Northern Arizona University. Let's see if I can get my slide to go here. Okay, so you all covered this, you know, this was my one slide on tribal sovereignty, you know, so you got the good stuff. This is just me saying, you know, tribes are sovereign and have been since time immemorial and will be forever. You know, that's a status that we are inherently have as tribal people, as first people to this continent. So I'm not going to go through all this, but I was so wonderful to get all that information. This picture is just this was during treaty making time, and it was one of the last treaties that was made in 1868. So just the amazing thing I think about when I think back about treaty making days, it's called a concept called canons of construction, where both parties, especially the party leading the contract, is supposed to write the contract in ways that the other side would understand most. And as you know, at this time, many of our brothers and sisters and ancestors did not understand how to read or write. So writing these treaties were, you know, were disadvantageous, I believe, to many of the tribes because it was written in a way that would take a lot of things that they didn't quite understand. You know, just the concept of understanding how, you know, we were stewards of the land, we always have been, but now you have to own the land. So that was a different concept for them. And I can only imagine how difficult it was for them. And many of these treaties, I would say almost all of them, were done under duress. They were being forced to do these things. So just thinking about that time and thinking about how strong our ancestors were and how brave they were to try to fight for what they could at the time under duress. So that's my opening statement, and I'll move on to tribes and how tribal sovereignty and climate change impacts us. You know, how tribal sovereignty impacts the climate change arena. You know, in the Southwest, I went to University of Oregon's website. They have a great page and they have all the adaptation plans lined up there. If you're ever stuck and you need some resource, go to that. ITEP has a great resource too, but I just wanted to highlight one of the adaptation plans that are currently, that was published. And this is the Ute Mountain Ute tribe. And this is one of the Southwest tribes. So environmental laws and codes and policies are just extremely important when it comes to climate change, because you're looking at your adaptive strategies. You're looking at the assessments. What are you going to do to start thinking about climate change and the steps forward? What are some of the assessments you have to do? Maybe you look at your water assessments. If you're here in the Southwest, water is a huge issue. The mitigation, and then you start looking into implementation. So those are the steps that my team at ITEP works on, is really helping tribes to get those adaptation plans in place. Because as you know, a strategic plan then leads to funding. So it really helps to have that plan in place, then you apply for funding, or you go for funding some other way. So, but climate change policies and environmental laws and policies are different, because sometimes in environmental law, people really think of things in silos. Let's look at just air quality, water quality, land issues. Let's all separate them, because you know that's how the laws are written at the federal level. So, but when tribes look at these issues, they're looking holistically. They're looking at, okay, you know, climate change impacts every part of our community, from the very young to our elders and all of them in between. So and it's not just the environmental issue, because it impacts our economy, it impacts our cultural life, it impacts all the things that we consider important. So when tribes started developing in adaptation plans, they started really looking holistically at ways to support their entire community. They included their culture, their traditional knowledges, their treaty rights. There's a lot of treaty rights that still exist and that still have to be fought for. They looked at self-determination, you know, what would make us resilient and what do we want to do as a people? And it also looks at economic independence. So those are really the big generators when you're working in an adaptation plan. So really those are outside the topic of climate change, but it's all umbrellaed under an adaptation plan. So one of the things that ITEP, when we're working with tribes, is to protect those traditional knowledges and to protect a lot of those things that come up when you're thinking holistically and you're being federally funded and you want to put everything in your plan. That's great. However, you have to be careful not to publish it. Like this one here, if this had sacred information, I would really recommend and caution that tribe to say, take that part out, you know, and submit your deliverable because you're being federally funded or state funded or however you're being funded, but maintain that information separately just to protect your own community. So that was one thing we started working on about, I would say about 6 years ago. And so those are some of the protections I really want to talk about. Now, moving on, last fall, we were, all of us in the climate arena were looking at what are the climate, what is the solving of climate. This is a document that came out from the Congress, and it walked you through all the climate initiatives that they were looking at. And so we decided to do a review. So it was led by AT&I, Don Sampson, Kyle, Dr. Kyle White was there was a bunch of us that worked on this. And what we decided to do was review it from a tribal lens so that we would be ready with the hopes. And thank goodness the administration has changed. And it's been, I mean, overnight, can you guys believe it? It was like, I was afraid to open some documents because it said climate change in it. And I was just like, and it's so refreshing to see an administration that understands just the threat that this climate change is upon our people. So what we did last fall is we put together a review. And I'm losing my thing here. So we wanted to position tribes into our review. We put forward some main values that we wanted the administration, the new administration, to understand. And that was, we wanted to position tribes for economic leadership and policies fostering the transition into carbon neutrality. You know, these are some of the things we wanted to work on that all the tribes were working on. We wanted to solidify tribe sovereignty, huge issue. We wanted this administration to understand what that meant. And just by all the things that have been happening currently, the naming of Secretary Madam Hallen, that was just amazing, right? And so I'm pretty sure sovereignty and the respect for tribal consultation and all those issues that we work on will be respected. So that was part of our values here. To ensure that protections for Indigenous cultures and that faced climate risk. So we're looking at how we're going to protect our people. You know, some people are more frontline than others. Our brothers and sisters up in Alaska are dealing with some very, very harsh issues in an immediate impact. So looking at some of those things. And then this is one of our things we wanted to do. For those who don't know the UN Declaration on Rights of Indigenous Peoples, we want this administration to adopt it as US policy. So some of these are high level things that we're asking this administration to really concentrate on and work with the tribes on. So the 12 pillars of climate change that came out of that review are some of the things that we put forward. And so this picture is of my friends at Native Renewables. If you don't know them, it's Wahala Johns, who's been now chosen to run the Department of Energy's Energy Department, and then one of my colleagues, Dr. Suzanne Singer, who are here in the Southwest on Navajo lands working on developing solar. So I bring that up because the 12 pillars, the first one is to invest in infrastructure and build a just and equitable, resilient, clean energy economy, and really looking at the clean part of energy. You know, for so long, we've been really dependent on fossil fuels. So really taking a turn around and looking at how we can incorporate these for our communities. I think I'm running out of time, so I'm going to start moving through these really quickly. Innovation and deployment of clean energy technologies. transform industry and domestic manufacturing of clean energy technologies. Again, these are all the things that we're asking. Break down barriers for clean energy technologies, huge issue. And I'm hoping I've been working with different teams on that issue. Invest in workers to build a fairer equality. One of the things that we work at ITEP is really building capacity and doing it from a cultural competency view. So then the next pillars is to invest in communities to cut out pollution and advance environmental justice. So I really want to highlight that last week, I think it was, everything's blurring lately, but the White House announced the Environmental Justice Advisory Council members. Our friend, Dr. Kyle White, huge scholar in the environmental justice world, Councilwoman Carletta Tulusi from the Havasupai, which is in the Grand Canyon. So we have a tribal leader, and our young Indigenous warrior here, Miss Jade Begay. Really, those are, I mean, that's a powerhouse team moving forward, really standing up for and supporting Indigenous issues on that advisory committee. So I look forward to the work they're going to be doing. So, Pillar 7 is to improve public health and manage climate risk to health infrastructure. 8 is to invest in agriculture for climate solutions. 9, to make communities more resilient to impacts of climate change. 10, protect and restore lands, waters, oceans, and wildlife. This is really coming to fruition with, at the time I was working with Congresswoman Dab Haaland and her team on the 3030 initiative, but now she's in the DOI. So I'm hoping this will really move forward and have a lot more impact. Number 11 is the national security and restoring international leadership. I'll talk about that a little bit later. And then strengthen core institutions. One of the things that we were asking for was that under the Obama administration, there was a task force made up of federal cabinet members that had all the cabinet members that were chosen from the different agencies directly speaking about and trying to solve real life issues on climate for tribes. And we're hoping we ask for that task force to come back together and again, really concentrate on tribal needs and climate change initiatives. And then lastly, I'm just going to throw this in because this is my own, the US tribes right now under the United Nations enterprise, if you will, are considered observers. So we can just, when we're asked, we can talk, but we're not members. And those are saved for countries. So each country is considered a member and they have a place at the table. So I know there are many, many tribes out here in the United States and other places, Indigenous peoples throughout the country that are really, really trying to change that designation. And so this is Dr. James Anaya from University of Colorado Law, and he's helping lead the initiative from the Navajo Nation. So, and I know it's coming from all over the world. So just one of my things that, I would like the tribes and Indigenous peoples to have a seat at the table at the United Nations. So, that's a wrap up. I hope that was 10 minutes and I hope it was enough to get you excited about this new administration in the political arena. Thank you.
That was super exciting. I loved it. Are you kidding? Thank you so much. I can't wait to have a bit more of a discussion on some of the topics you presented in here. Nobody rushed through your presentation at all. Everyone has valuable information to share. And so just soaking in a bit of that, we're going to hear some similar, but yet some very different thoughts from Dr. Stephanie Carroll. So,
thank you, Melody. So I'm going to share my screen. Please let me know once I start my presentation if it is not in presentation mode. I'm a slow learner for getting to the multiple screens. All right, fantastic. Well, thank you, Anne-Marie. That was a really exciting presentation. And I'm gonna take a tangential leap off to the side, but hopefully some of the content will wrap back and touch on some of the points made in this presentation right before and even the conversations earlier. So I want to start by acknowledging the profound collection of knowledge and experience here. And really, it's an honor to engage with this group. And so I know many of you may have either seen me or one of my colleagues present on these topics around Indigenous data sovereignty, or that you yourself are actively engaged in data governance efforts. So bear with me for this crash course with a few provocations woven throughout. I just want to note too, and some of my commitments and responsibilities to this work is early on when I started working around Indigenous data sovereignty, which that term itself was coined about 5 years ago. But one of the comments I received from a group of tribal leaders was around how really this work is making what's old new again, and flavorful and exciting within the avenues of data innovations that are occurring in the broader world today. And so I really want to make sure we understand and touch back on some of the knowledge and knowledge systems that Anne-Marie was talking about, and how those are really important components of defining our relationship to data. And so that said, I'll start with acknowledging some important points around Indigenous peoples and data. And obviously from our conversations already, sovereignty matters. And data are our relations. And I'll talk a little bit more about that, but it really is a story about how we live in relation to our information and knowledge. Data are critical to the exercise of tribal sovereignty. Only Indigenous peoples and nations can exercise Indigenous data sovereignty. Enacting Indigenous data sovereignty includes both data for governance, as well as the governance of data. Tribally driven data work requires relationships with other data actors and experts for both stewardship and care of data, as well as expertise. And finally, assertions of Indigenous data sovereignty spur innovation and design in data and research policy and practice more broadly. So Indigenous knowledge systems, as we know, are informed by longitudinal inquiry lasting generations, and Indigenous communities form, test, adapt, and refine their knowledge systems based upon careful observations and other interactions. Many Indigenous cultures utilize a variety of oral and physical mechanisms for transmitting knowledge and information. Here you see some tools for storing and conveying information and data from clockwise, a totem pole, the Lakota winter count, an Otham calendar stick, and a wampum belt. And there's a variety of uses and applications for all of these. But by and large, the settler colonial experience has been comprised of various efforts to kill, suppress, or co-opt Indigenous knowledge systems. Today, Indigenous peoples' data include data generated by Indigenous peoples, as well as by governments and other institutions on and about Indigenous peoples and their territories. Indigenous peoples' data comprise information and knowledge about the environment, land, skies, resources, and non-humans, which they have relations. Information about Indigenous individuals, such as administrative data, census data, health data, and so forth. And then information and knowledge about Indigenous peoples as collectives, including our traditional information, oral histories, ancestral and clan knowledges, and so forth. Indigenous data sovereignty is the right of Indigenous peoples to govern their data, from collection and storage to use and reuse. Finding its foundations in inherent sovereignty, only Indigenous peoples and nations as rights holders can exercise Indigenous data sovereignty. Indigenous data sovereignty is a responsibility and an expression of the ways, traditions, and roles that communities have for the care and use of their knowledge. Using a human rights framework, Indigenous data sovereignty leverages tools such as laws, policies, and agreements, including what Anne-Marie mentioned, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, leveraging nation state or state recognition of Indigenous peoples, treaties, and other mechanisms. Indigenous data sovereignty underscores that knowledge belongs to the collective and is fundamental to who we are as Indigenous peoples. Data are critical to the exercise of tribal sovereignty. Indigenous peoples require data for governance and self-determined decision-making. And at the same time, Indigenous nations, like many other governments and institutions, create and enact data policies and practices that align with their values and knowledge systems. These activities of Indigenous data governance are means of implementing greater Indigenous data sovereignty. What we see now is that as Indigenous nations rebuild their governance systems, they are also reclaiming their data systems. This slide itself really could be a book or a long story, and I'd love to talk about it more with people. But for our purposes here today, I'll say that currently we're often in a state of data dependency, where Indigenous data and tribal data systems have long been suppressed and usurped to meet others' needs and desires. And we're on a journey from this settler colonial experience of data dependency to data sovereignty, with Indigenous peoples leading and creating data knowledge and information. And we're having a variety of different relationships and experiences with other data actors, so with other governments, with researchers, and many others. And so we've been in these relationships where a lot of times data were created by them, for them, or sometimes external actors were creating data by them, for us. And we're really moving to a place where we're creating and utilizing Indigenous data and knowledge for us, but also thinking about how we do that and share our knowledge and information in ways that align with our values, and in which we can still have a relationship to those data and information as they travel through external data systems, so that we can make sure that our permissions for use of that data, our protocols for how those data can be shared, but also when those data can be used, are in relation to those data as they travel through data systems and so forth. So I wanted to show this slide, which is a piece of work that Dominique David Chavez did during her dissertation work a couple years ago. And it really relates to the last kind of slide of the bias with us and so forth, experiences of who is really in control and of the research and data processes. And so as part of this, we're talking about in climate research, how much engagement or leadership is there from Indigenous communities. And so this scale you see going from no engagement to contractual engagement, to consultative engagement, to collaborative, collegial, and finally, Indigenous processes are centered, where Indigenous value systems, historical context, community members have authority over the research process. And so importantly, Dominique in her research found that the vast majority of climate studies, 87%, fell on the left side of the spectrum, where you really had extractive relationships, where there was no engagement or only contractual or consultative relationships. And so we're really trying to move these relationships towards Indigenous research and data governance, where we had self-determined research around climate science engaging. So how do you do that? And importantly, really what we're talking about here are enhancing data relationships, where you have tribes governing tribal data by their own values and systems, but in relationship with others, so that data stewards, so universities, governments, researchers, are managing data by tribal standards and using Indigenous values. So some of the efforts around this work have included communities in practice and advocacy around Indigenous data sovereignty in Aotearoa, New Zealand, Australia, Canada, the United States, and networks of networks, so international networks, most importantly at this point, the Global Indigenous Data Alliance. And so formed in 2019, the Global Indigenous Data Alliance is an international network which reinforces the rights to engage in decision-making in accordance with Indigenous values and collective interests. And so the first activity out of GIDA was to finalize and release high-level principles for the governance of Indigenous data. So in response to the increased generation and use of data and open data, big data, open science, and research environments, and limited opportunities for Indigenous control, a network of Indigenous scholars led the foundational research, drafting, and the engagement and commenting and editing of towards finalization of the CARE principles. So the principles of collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility, and ethics, and their sub-principles set forth critical considerations for non-tribal data creators, stewards, and users, and are designed to guide the inclusion of Indigenous peoples in data governance and increase their access to data. The CARE principles really shift the focus of data governance from consultation to values-based relationships, and do so by advocating too for the inclusion of people and purpose orientation in data governance. And this really complements the popular FAIR principles, which are findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. The FAIR principles seek to increase data sharing, but they also, in companionship with the CARE principles, should be seen as necessary to allow Indigenous peoples to govern, access, and use their data and to share on their own terms. And largely the reasons around that are because there's a lot of data out there, ranging from ethnographic material to biological material.
So this is our first time of experiencing some technical difficulties. Everybody, just bear with the delight that is Zoom meetings. I want to say where we left off with Indigenous data sovereignty was super exciting. I'm on the, I have my screen split because I'm taking notes furiously in the workbook. I'm on page 17 with session notes. Those are such amazing slides. Also remember, this session is being recorded. So if I'm kind of a geek and I really like to look up these actual things and then cite the CARE principles myself because I think they're absolutely brilliant. So if you find that you want to do something like that, this session is recorded. You don't need to feel like you need to get your camera out and snap it immediately. Kind of let all this information soak in. I know that we're looking at getting Stephanie back on so that she can finish her presentation. But just, in some ways, I'm kind of glad to have a breather from that wealth of information. And already I hope that you're thinking to yourself, those presentations have a lot of overlap. They do. And I think that's the beautiful thing when you work in Indian country is it's all related. All the materials, all of the concepts, they all come in together into play. So I just want to share that with everyone while we're looking at getting back Stephanie. And she's not back yet. I have to think a little bit on this. I think what we're going to do is that I am going to let Stephanie finish up her presentation because I also don't want her to panic at all. We have still an hour, so we're by no means in a hurry. But I am going to shift over to District Chairman Nunez. I think that, again, sovereignty has so many different connotations, and talking about self-determination, talking about our communities. And when this conference was being developed, we discovered that the San Javier district of the Danatam Nation had granted personhood to saguaros. So that's what I was thinking, natural sovereignty. We've seen this with other tribes with lakes, we've seen this with trees. And so I really am grateful to have Austin, who really speaks to such a global audience about the compassion and care that he has and his tribe has for Mother Earth. If you could please begin your presentation, Austin. Thank you.
Thank you, Melody. And again, good morning to all of you. And I could share my screen. Let me try to do that.
I think I'm going to have to give you a moment to share the screen.
Okay. While you're doing that, I just wanted to say again that our community here is called WAC, which is the traditional name of our community relating to the water that used to flow in the Santa Cruz River. And our people here were an independent community. And our first European contact were with the Spaniards that came in the 1500s. And they wrote about the flourishing fields that we had and how we didn't fight them off, but we instead fed them, knowing that they were looking for gold. And since we didn't have it, they moved on northward. And so later on, when the United States government was formed, then that's when we became the Papago tribe of Arizona at that point, and combined all of our respective communities, villages. There were about 5 separate groups of all of them with their distinct dialects, and we went ahead and agreed to accept that form of government back then. And we had lands that extended all the way to the Gulf of California, and then northward by Phoenix area, and then westward to the Colorado River area, and then eastward to the San Pedro River. But now we're reduced to 3 million acres. And within that 3 million acres, we have 11 political districts. So the political name of our community today is Sanibel District. And we comprise of 73,000 acres and 2,300 members. And the balance of the main Tohono Nation reservation is comprised of 10 districts, and then the 11th district is close to Hilo Bend, San Lucie district. So Tohono is what we changed our name to in 1986 when we had a constitutional amendment. Tohono meaning desert, O'odham meaning people. So that's who we are as today. And we've always referred to ourselves as O'odham, meaning the people. And so I just wanted to let you know about that brief background. And here in Sanibel, we have always had reverence for the water which flowed in the Santa Cruz River, and that was the reason that our ancestors, the Hohokam, and our forefathers settled in this area to divert the water to irrigate our crops, corn, the tepary bean, which is native to this area, squash, watermelons. And so we've always been an independent thinking community because of the fact that we have the water to be able to subsist and to thrive. And that changed over the course of years. And of course, now we're a subset of the Tohono Nation. And the Tohono Nation is the one that directly deals with the federal government and the state and other local jurisdictions. However, in our case, being that we are also geographically separate from the Tohono Nation by a gap of about 40 miles, and in order for us to survive, we've continued to think independently and continue to do what we need to do to be able to survive here. And when we do need the assistance of our central government, then we do ask. So my charge today was to speak about personhood, and this is in relation to the Haitian or Saguaro. Melody?
Yes, sir.
Are you able to see my screen?
I am.
Okay, great. All right, so I wanted to point out that we share a border with Mexico today of 75 miles. And there are 2 districts there, the Guwa district and Chucutuc district. So given the fact that the saguaro we hold near and dear to our hearts. The saguaro provides their fruit, which we use to, of course, we gather, we eat it fresh off the plant. And then when we do get the first plant, we've always been instructed to give thanks to Creator for the plant itself, and then also to the plant, thanking him for for the abundance they provided to us. And then after we ingest the fruit, we take the inside of it, which is red, and it tastes somewhat similar to a fig, is what I'm told, but it does have its own distinct taste. And so we take some of the juice inside and then place it on our hearts to give us long life. And then the shell of it, of the saguaro fruit, we place on the ground facing up to attract rain. And then so once we gather the fruit, then we also use it to make jam. And we save the seeds for use during the summertime. We form it into cakes, and we use that in the wintertime to subsist on. And then part of the jams are then the fruit is fermented into a ceremonial wine, and then that wine is used in our rain ceremony, which is a 4-day ceremony to call for rain, and but to also share the bounty of the saguaro fruit in the form of a wine. And through that too, as the ceremony is being conducted, we're praying for rain, we're dancing, and we call that dance Kohimerik. And we do that for 4 nights, and then the morning of the 4th day, actually it's 3 nights, and then the morning of the 4th day at sunrise is when the dancing stops, the singing stops, and then we sit down and then share the wine, and then we acknowledge each other as we say Hajun, which is relative, and then the songs from each of the various communities are sung, and this goes on until the ceremonial wine is gone, and then everybody goes home. And that was the only point in time that our people had consumed any alcohol, which was 2% by volume. But when we all went home and prayed for the rain, continued to pray for the rain would usually come within 4 days. And then so the rains would be used to irrigate our crops. And the main reservation, the rain was, the flood waters were used, diverted, and put forth into their farms, known as oxygen farming. So we continue to revere the saguaro, and it's still pretty much plentiful. And as time went on, even though the border was created, we didn't pay much attention to it. Our people freely went back and forth because when the border was created, it left some of our relatives in Mexico, and there are about 15 villages still today that comprise of our Alton people. And the problem came up with regard to the border issue was when the individuals putting, I guess, because of the drug runners and then also the human trafficking that came about several years ago. And that's when everybody began to take notice of the border. And that's when the Border Patrol were sent in to guard the area with our permission back then, with our leadership, and also affected our ancestral lands on either side of the current day Tonga Nation Reservation. And of course, in the last 5 years under the Trump administration, there was a movement to build a wall. And so with that wall came the destruction of our sacred saguaro. And they bulldozed and most of the saguaros that were in their way. And then in one case, they were sold, even though it was illegal to sell saguaros. The state of Arizona does guard the saguaro, and you have to get a permit in order to be able to sell and transport saguaros within the state. that particular subcontractor didn't pay attention to any of that. And so that's being followed up on. But at the same while, it also destroyed some of our ceremonial sites there, our ancestral remains were affected. And so our people, of course, wanted to get that all of that stopped. And some of our people did it by direct action against the Border Patrol. And then on our side, we were informed that there was a funding through the from the Calliope Foundation through the Indigenous Alliance Without Borders entity, and they formed a group called Healing the Border, and they asked myself to be part of the group. And we also have Berlin Jose, who is from Chucutuc District, who is current president of Dalnatam Mexico group. Then he is also former vice chairman of our Dalnatam Nation. And we have representation from the Pasquayaqui tribe, and then also from Wallapai, Hopi, and Tewa, in the form of an individual who comes from all those communities. And the group's intention was to assist in stopping the border wall construction through meaningful dialogue and through prayer. And so part of that involved having ceremony on our ancestral lands just west of the Dalnatam Nation at Lukeville and west of Lukeville on the border. There's a spring there called Atawaipa, and it was formed into a pond years ago. And so that was being affected by the groundwater wells that were being dug in the area and lowered the groundwater. And so the spring flow was diminishing as well as the spring. So we went there to offer prayer and to save the spring, ask for prayers to save the spring, but then also to stop the border wall construction. We had runners from Mexico who came, all of them to run to the border north, and then all of them from our area running south. And we had representation from the Kumeyaay, who were also affected in San Diego area. They were present, as well as our Akimatawatan brethren from up north, from Gila River, Salt River. We all converged, and this was nothing really. We were going as a small group, but as word got out, that's how it culminated. And through that, we were able to, again, inform people that, you know, our ancestral lands are important to us, they're sacred. The plant life is important, and all of nature is important, and they need to be respected, and that the border wall needs to stop. The construction of it needs to stop. So in one of the other projects was to talk to our Mexican O'odham relatives and get their stories about their experience with dealing with the Border Patrol, dealing with the drug cartels, and just surviving in the area. So that is being put together. And then the other component that we then looked at was to go ahead and look at having the Saguaro, I guess, to acknowledge in writing the fact that the Haitian we view as a person. And so the Healing the Border developed a resolution which our district council here enacted along with Chucutuc District. And Chucutuc District, they were the first ones that enacted their resolution to protect the Haitian and to provide personhood. And so the other political districts of the nation were asked to do likewise. And at this point, there are 7 districts that have signed on, passed the resolution, and we're currently in the process of going through the oversight committees of the Dalnatam Legislative Council to ask them for support to relay to the Legislative Council to ask them also to provide a similar resolution. And the resolution speaks to the historical aspects of what I was just speaking to, and even in our creation stories, there are stories about how the Hashan came to us and involving young people and families, and these stories are normally told during the wintertime, and so the fourth whereas references part of one of those stories in which an Odom boy prophesizes that I will turn myself into a saguaro, so I shall last forever and bear fruit each summer. And so that is what has been happening, and that's why we view the Hashan as a person, but not only the Hashan, but all of plant life, knowing that all plant life have their own energies. They have their gifts to us as Odom, and as humans, we consume them, certainly, as I mentioned earlier, with the foods that we eat, and in eating them, that they are medicines, and there are particular medicines that each of our respective indigenous nations use to heal ourselves. And the universal ones are, of course, sage and cedar, and even specific medicines that enlighten a person's mind, body, spirit. And so the resolution speaks to that and mentions that even back in the beginning when the non-Odom came to the area, that they also recognized that the Hashan and the use of the fruit is similar to how Christianity views bread and wine, and so that they recognize that we treat the Hashan similar to that, and so we have an inherent right to be able to continue to use the saguaro, and even as the indigenous people of this area, we have an inherent right to govern ourselves in the way that we see fit to survive and to protect all that is within our realm here of our ancestral lands. And then the resolution then later on speaks to ways in which the federal government should step up and restore the plants in the area, and then to have a youth group be able to assist with that, and then to continue to look at ways to remove the wall, the border wall that has been constructed. So even though, as we know, we're all connected, everything's interconnected. So this is just one aspect of fighting this political battle about the border wall construction, and still having ancestral lands and lives here that the way that we want it to be, so that we can continue to thrive as O'odham people. And this resolution will continue to be looked at with our O'odham Legislative Council, and I'm hopeful that perhaps before too long that they will pass a similar resolution. So I wanted to review that with you, and I'm certainly this is more from a grassroots level of what I'm just speaking about. And myself, it's very I'm glad that all of us as Indigenous people are looking at climate change and ways to adapt. And I'm very grateful to the organizers of this forum to bring all the professionals together to discuss this, and for us, and myself included, learn from all of you. Because if without rain in our area here, then excuse me, the Hashan and all the plant life will begin to excuse me, diminish. And being that we're a desert community, we have to contend with the heat and the scarcity of water. And so we definitely are working on a plan for the Tonopah Nation, which is being developed through our Water Resources Department with Dr. Celso Villegas at the helm. And so we again will continue to pray for rain. And of course, when we have our ceremonies, we include everyone throughout the world. And so I'll just go ahead and leave it at that and turn it back over to you, Melody. And thank you again for this opportunity to be able to speak to the Haudenosaunee personhood.
That was just beautiful. Thank you so much. I'm really just soaking in everything you had to say, along with all the other speakers. So appreciative of your words.
I really apologize, everybody, and thanks for hanging in there. I did want to just close up with a couple slides, especially because I saw some comments, and I feel like it's a really big honor now to follow up to Austin, because that was some fantastic work that was going on there. So again, apologies for the failure. I had two little kiddos running up to me immediately to announce the outage here. So what I just wanted to talk about quickly was, moving back to Indigenous data governance and putting it into practice is there's a variety of different ways that it can be done, and at different scales. So from the communities and tribal nation scale through scales of universities and states, as well as nation states and internationally. And some of the tools that can be used, of course, are law. So leveraging laws and leveraging tribal resolutions and tribal laws, as well as policies that governments, institutions, organizations, professional guidelines, ethics, so training, but also the utilization of metadata labels or information that can embed ethics within data. So metadata is basically the data about data, the story about data that goes into data systems. And finally, really thinking through what some infrastructure changes for data infrastructure that we can make. So putting in place data standards, so things like setting how provenance for Indigenous data should occur. So what information is needed to adhere to Indigenous data within mainstream data systems, to say who is in relation to those data and who is responsible for those data, and what are the protocols they set forth, and what's the programming from a computer science perspective that needs to happen to put that in place. And so right before I got cut off, I saw a comment, and I wanted to, they actually anticipated something that I was going to talk about, which is so I run the Collaboratory for Indigenous Data Governance, which is a research group at the University of Arizona, but in partnership with a number of other universities, including Colorado State University, where Dominique David Chavez is at, who I spoke about earlier. And so we have two projects that are looking at ethical Indigenous data governance at universities and federal entities. And so thinking through and examining what are the factors and indicators that represent effective and ethically responsible research, practice, and data governance in Indigenous communities. So this is looking at tribal research codes, tribal data codes, but also larger scale, which some of you see in this picture here, documents that have been issued by Indigenous peoples around how to care for these information. And then examining to what extent these factors and indicators are represented in codes of ethics and responsible research and data guidelines at US federal agencies and universities. And so the research framework we're using are to analyze those documents that are out there. So for instance, you see here, we're excerpting stuff from the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and then coding those. And so the smaller green parts are the smaller kind of codes that we tag on to these. The important thing to take away is that we had 6 broad themes from the analysis of these tribal and indigenous, more broad Indigenous guidelines Those came out as cultural responsiveness, reciprocal relationships, honoring rights, ethics and balance, centering Indigenous governance, and being a good ancestor. And so our next step from that is going to be to analyze those federal documents that we've collected and the university documents, and then survey Indigenous and interview Indigenous leaders as well as Indigenous scholars, and then individuals at institutions such as universities and federal agencies who are working within the spheres of these guidelines and documents. And then create a set of indicators for what are some things that should be thought about having in those policies so they better reflect Indigenous sovereignty and the host of other topics that I just outlined here. So cultural responsiveness, reciprocal relationships, and so forth. And some of the methods we'll do with that is using some community engagement through events, hopefully soon, with both tribal leaders and scholars, and then mainstream data ethics and policy leaders from across the country. And then create resources. So in anticipation of that, we've already started working with some a set of university repositories who are kind of taking and make researcher responsibilities to share data and put them into a collection, a reality. And so how can those repositories create policies and practices that align with Indigenous rights and interests? And so this work obviously is important because it seeks to inform new standards for these repositories and universities and federal entities, and provide data and information to guide the development of these new resources and trainings, to build capacity at tribes and institutions. Critically, we're mentoring Indigenous scholars through these projects and strengthening intertribal and cross-cultural collaborative partnerships at national levels. We're really seeking to inform research policy and data governance to enhance accountability and improve equity, and support reciprocity and trust between research institutions and Indigenous communities. And one of the things that I always say, because sometimes data seems abstract, and especially when you're collating a lot of different information together, people sometimes forget that these are our relations that we're talking about and we're putting into these programs. And so how do we set forth and maintain those relationships? And so one of the responsibilities that I always say, no matter where a researcher is that your institution and your responsibility is to have good relationships with the Indigenous peoples on whose lands you sit and work every day. And then build up from there. And so how do you make sure that you institute those relationships throughout your work? Even if you're working at these very high levels where it seems like you have no connection to community, you always need to be responsible to someone. And so with that, I'll just close quickly and say thank you to the folks who work with me, and just hand it back over to Melody.
I can start if nobody else wants to. The overlap that I see is that tribes are taking control and using and protecting their sovereignty. They are really moving forward innovatively, looking at all the different spectrums that they can. And in the case of Dr. Carroll, looking at data, that's an emerging issue in the issue of the natural rights of the Saguaro or the Hassan, I don't know how you say that correctly, really innovatively using tribal sovereignty, the fundamentals that we are our own people, we are stewards of our own land, and we can make our own decisions on what we value and really incorporate laws and codes and policy around those issues in the case of my topic as well. So those are the things that I see, is that once you use your tribal sovereignty, it's very hard to back off. So I encourage all of you to be creative and really think about how you can protect your rights, but also use your tribal sovereignty. Do you guys have, do any of my other panelists have any comments on that question? Just how the overlap?
Yeah, I liked what you said, and I think it's I think one of the important pieces too is to make the link between you know, tribal laws, tribal codes, tribal resolutions, all of this work that tribes are doing in their communities, making the link between all of that, kind of setting forth sovereign action and self-determination with what other institutions need to do and what researchers need to do, which is they need to look to those laws, the codes, the resolutions, the programs that tribes have as the guidance for how you should be relating and your responsibilities for working with Indigenous communities. And so really thinking through how that, and I'm kind of link this to something that Melody just put in there about building capacity through sovereignty, which is how you then work to utilize these actions and harness your own people, right, to be doing a lot of your work, that are grounded and able to decide when you might need somebody from somewhere else to help with something, and when you have your own capacity internally. And so how do we strategically too begin to build up our youth and connect them strongly with elders and access Western science education and bring them to be doing some of the critical work that requires multiple knowledge systems and knowledge streams to be able to address some of the real pressing issues that climate presents, both from an environmental and a human health standpoint, and so on and so forth, and a cultural standpoint too.
One of the areas that I see is with regard to the federal program that's called 93-638 program, wherein tribes can go ahead and enter into agreements with the federal government to undertake programs that the Bureau of Indian Affairs had historically administered. And so we were able to secure that through our Palmatam Legislative Council with regard to our water rights issue, and to be able to implement the Southern Arizona Water Rights Settlement Act. So through that, we are building capacity in all the areas needed to administer and implement that, for us, a large-scale program such as that, involving farming and then also restoring riparian areas with excess Colorado River water that isn't used for farming, and then also to store the majority of it in our aquifer, and then be able to continue to, at least for in our particular community, have water availability. And the thought and desire of our elders back in the early 70s was to see the Santa Cruz River flow again. And so that couldn't be done without volumes and billions of dollars to do that. So at any rate, what has naturally occurred is, because of farming and the recharging of the aquifer, the groundwater table has risen, and a portion of the Santa Cruz River has begun to flow. And so this is the second year, going on the third year, that the flow has begun again. It's a quarter of a mile and maybe 200 feet wide, but nonetheless, it's significant to us, and we certainly celebrate it. And we had a ceremony to honor the water and our elders who prayed about the water returning into the river. So through that, we are then engaged with multiple entities in the Tucson area, and this area is called the Santa Cruz Valley, in restoring the watershed. And that is really significant to us and everyone that lives in this area. So through that, we're also looking at ways in which to engage our youth to become involved in that. And we've always, pushed them to obtain the best education that they can, and then to come back and to work for us. And fortunately, some of them have done that, and there are, of course, certainly some in law, and so they've been able to help us. And so one of our areas that we see a need to fill is archiving our documents. because years ago that wasn't looked at that strongly. And so today, when we talk about certain issues, we try to look back. We can't locate the documents. So a few years ago, we started compiling all of that. And with the modernization of storing all the information, we begun to digitize those documents. And I know there's other tribes that are doing a fantastic job with that. So, and that I see as part of strengthening your sovereignty and to rely on your specific history and as you move forward. So I just wanted to mention those things.
Much for that, Austin. And thank you all for your patience. If my panelists can please nod if you can hear me. Yay, I am trying a new technology. Thank you all. And this will be recorded for all posterity. Fantastic. So I want to touch on one last thing. We have about 15 minutes to close. I really would like, we have a huge audience here from many different backgrounds. And so I know that some of this is brand new information. Each of you touched briefly on the concept of sovereignty as something for all our relations, which, how I understand that, is really about more than our human relations. Our relations to waters and to lands. I heard that in Anne Marie's discussion about one of her points was about that. I heard that in Indigenous data sovereignty and your care principles, and definitely about that. So if each of you can maybe just take a little moment and from your perspective, share why including all our relations and sovereignty is so pivotal to understanding working with tribes. And I'm going to ask, let's see, I know, Anne Marie, I've been asking you to start, but I'm going to ask you to start again.
Can you, one more quick time say, just so I think I have it in my head, but if you could just say one more time, the question.
Why is understanding how sovereignty is an exercise of working with all our relations?
Okay, yeah, a great question.
It's so important for our people who are looking to collaborate with tribes. What does that mean?
Yeah, thank you. And now I understand a little bit better. Working with our non-Indigenous relatives is incredibly important, because we're all human beings. If you get down to it, we are all human beings, and we all basically want the basic values for one another. We want clean water, we want clean air, we want clean lands for our children. Those are fundamentals, whether they, they really want to say if it's a political hot button or not, but those are fundamentals that we all want. And so really working with our allies that are in tune with Indigenous types of knowledges is important, and really safeguarding those relationships too. I really have strong friendships and with people that I work with outside of the office, just because, we both believe and they understand the concept of Mother Earth and protecting Mother Earth and raising your children to be warriors for Mother Earth. Those are all concepts that they understand. And if they don't understand, then you teach them gently, you just walk them through, and say, these are things that I believe in, and having those open conversations to look at things. ITIP for the last 30 years almost has been working very closely with the federal government and building capacity for all 574 tribes. And our climate change program, if we look at just the last question, it has a cohort working with the FEMA department to build the alliance there so that tribes have a direct line to funding when they're done with their adaptation planning, which is an issue we had on. We would get to the adaptation place, then the implementation would have a hard step. So we really work with a lot of our allies, and now we're working with DOE, we're working with other federal agencies, and really having that open concept. The last administration put a really hard, our federal partners that were our allies in a hard place. So I really commend those folks that are working in the federal government that had to endure that, what was really difficult in my opinion. and are still allies today. So thank you very much for being there and continuing to work on behalf of tribes and people of color, really. And so those are, if we don't have those allies, we would be really in a hard place. We'd be in a real hard place. So be open, stay open, and have those conversations with your partners.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Anne-Marie. Switching it up, Austin, I think I would love to hear your different perspective on how working with all our relations, which includes our non-human relations, how does that impact you?
Well, I do realize, as I mentioned earlier, that everything is interconnected. All the plant life, the animal life, the water, the air that we breathe, they're all interconnected. And if you harm one aspect of the whole cycle of life, then it triggers the rest of it. And as humans, we and indigenous people, we have been placed here, as I understand from our elders, to safeguard all of the gifts from Creator, plant life, animal life, as I mentioned, the water, the air, the earth, and we have not done a very good job as humankind, and we're seeing the effects of that today. I was just looking at a documentary regarding the Okavanga in Africa, and how that is being slowly eroding, diminish the water flow. And what struck me is what they said was that 77% of wilderness has been destroyed since man's arrival, with 10% of that being destroyed since 1990. So, all along, even though initially, of course, we embraced everything that was around us as in our natural world, we began to develop technology that affected the environment. And we as Indigenous people have always informed our non-Indigenous relatives, we are all a part of the web of life, and our great ancestors have specific quotes on that, previous Indigenous leaders. And we've been saying the same thing, believe the same thing all along, all the machinations of the new technology and quests for power and greed by some of the dominant society have been going on. Now there are good people that have recognized that, are stepping back and wanting to learn more from us as Indigenous people. And we know that Mother Earth and all of her bounty will continue to survive if we as humans somehow dissipate. The Mother Earth doesn't need us, we need her. So we need to continue to work with our partners outside of our specific Indigenous communities to have them think along the same lines for all of us, and certainly for those yet to come, and first, and of course for our sacred Mother Earth. So those are my thoughts on that.
Thank you. While I gush publicly, I just want everyone on this call to recognize those words came from our tribal elected leadership. How powerful is that? I'm just so grateful that you've given us some time and are sharing that understanding that that is actually an intersection of our political leadership and our traditional leadership into one thought to share with you all. So thank you. That was very, very touching and beautiful and powerful, as always, Austin.
Thank you very much.
So Stephanie, looking again at how does working with all our relations in Indigenous data sovereignty, what does that mean to you? And if that does let us know if that also includes working with your non-human relations.
Sure. So I wrote 3 little pieces of notes down for myself. And the last one that I wrote down right when Austin started speaking is that one of the things that guides my work and that I like as a concept that that my Maori friends bring to the table is that they operate in this mahi-mana role, where you have your leadership setting forth an agenda and setting forth the values. And then you have your worker bees, who are people like me. So it's people in organizations and who are scholars and others who take direction from the leaders. And so I was going to make that point as something that drives me. And Austin, really, you set forth the link, and Melody, you made that link explicit of how we really learn from and take direction from. And one of the important ways that I see this linking to your question about all of our relations is that so I find myself sometimes in these big data discussions or these work groups with people who are bigwigs and, for instance, like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, who come to these discussions and say explicitly that data are neutral and that that they're, Indigenous peoples don't have any links to climate change data. And these are people who are making decisions and writing big international pieces about how we should relate about climate change. And so I take it as my responsibility to direct them to the words of our leaders and the words of our elders, so they understand what our relationships are, not just as Indigenous peoples, but as humans on this earth to all of our both living, non-living, human, non-human companions and spirits. And so I think, one of the ways that I really push that is I've somehow gotten into a lot of discussions around genomics. And here in the US, when you talk about genomics research, it's very human focused. And they think that a lot of the solutions are going to come from human focused work. And this is driven by our funding schema in the US and so forth. But we need to make sure that we bring to the discussion topics around flora, fauna, seeds, and our responsibility to seeds, and our relationships to seeds, as well as our ancestors, and how we care for and allow access to and use of data and information about all of us should be informed from our more comprehensive set of values and beliefs, and should not just be really pushed into one sphere. So like, how is the climate impacting humans? You can't pull that out of the nested experience of how we all interact with both the environment and our relationships with others, including non-humans. And so thank you both, Anne-Marie, Melody, and Austin for your leadership in this area.